one intervene at this particular moment, being true to all of these different dimensions of yourself? Because you know the mainstream is going to try to reduce you down to one niche, one label, one category, one particular way of looking at the world. How do you sustain that and still give the world the gifts that you were put here to give? I mean, it sounds abstract, but it's a very moral and spiritual question in a way. Yeah. And it's more than charisma. People talk about your charisma. Oh, Lord, the sister got charisma. But it's more than that. Oh, yes. It's a whole organic coming together in AOC at this particular historical moment.
Well, I think in this context, what I find to be the spiritual practice that I have been practicing the most, or perhaps discipline that I've been practicing the most ever since I even won my primary, is non-attachment. And that is I think it is the most important thing in my position, because politics, the intimidation, the pressure, the immense intimidation and pressure to conform is entirely based around your attachment to these things. If I can threaten what you are attached to, then if I can take away something that you are attached to, then I can make you do what I want you to do. And so what I have to practice every day is non-attachment to the things that we are naturally attached to. For example, attachment to my office. I cannot be attached to keeping my seat as a member of Congress if I'm going to do my job. Because my job is not to be the congresswoman of New York's 14th district. I guess I should say that is my job. That is not my mission.
Oh, yes. Okay.
And my mission is to advance principles of a better world and to advance a better world. And that is my mission. And if I am overly attached to this seat, I cannot do my job.
Welcome once again to the Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Vrettos. I'm a sociologist who's taught at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and Yeshiva University here in New York City. Traditional progressive movements have rarely incorporated an integrated and systemic spiritual worldview in its organizing to bring about political and economic justice. As a result, they failed to build and sustain mass-based insurgent movements that address the complex material and spiritual needs we all have. If progressive movements are to finally succeed, they need to acknowledge that spiritual values, as opposed to institutional religious values, have been and continue to be central for the vast majority of human beings from whatever cultural, religious, political, humanist, atheist, or agnostic tradition they might have. We'll need to have the moral courage, commitment, and intellectual honesty to take these spiritual values seriously and act on them if we want to repair and heal the world and ourselves. Our guest today of the Radical Imagination is Jonathan Soto, a community organizer and social justice activist who lives and practices those values. He currently serves as one of the key political organizers and strategists for the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez campaign, working as an interfaith organizer in the New York Congresswoman's 14th congressional district, where more than 75% of her constituents are people of color, deeply and actively rooted in religious traditions and practices. Jonathan himself is a child of working-class Pentecostal ministers who moved from Puerto Rico to New York when he was a child. Before working for the campaign, He was an associate vice president of strategic initiatives at Union Theological Seminary. For him, engaging in religion creatively in public life is a form of praxis or action. Faith is inherently civic, reaching those who are economically and politically vulnerable in working class places like churches, houses of worship, mosques, temples, and synagogues. These are places of voluntary association where people congregate and organize. They can become portals for mutual aid, clinical services, and critical services for immigrants, the poor, and the working class. It's where you'll find Jonathan much of the time. So, Jonathan, welcome. Thank you for taking the time out to be with us. And we like to think of the radical imagination as sort of sacred space for the radical imagination. So you're on friendly turf here. And thank you so much again for being with us here on this program.
And thank you so much for the invitation and for making that key distinction from the beginning between institutional religious practice and spirituality. It's so important and often lighted over.
That's my first question, because as I said in the opening, you are working with so many people coming from that traditional background. And yet, what are you attempting to do? Are they resistant to the sort of spiritual violence? Let's flesh that out. What are you attempting to do to make sense or help them understand or expand on their own traditional values? Help me understand that and our audience.
Yeah, well, oftentimes what we see is that institutions and religious practices used as a tool by the ruling class, oftentimes to delude, to pacify, and to delay the necessary revolution, both material and spiritual, that needs to happen. So we've seen the establishment of hierarchy in so much religious practice. And I think the goal is to understand that there is an interdependence that we, the individual, have with all of each other, whether it's in the collective unconscious or whether it's in our spiritual kinship. And it goes beyond nationality, it goes beyond class, it goes beyond race in many of those respects. But I think that we see that it needs to get changed. It needs to be inverted, and it needs to be revolutionized. Because if we do not understand that people's oftentimes deeply personal experience with religion is shaped in a way that is not necessarily good. It's meant to establish hierarchy, and I think a working class, one spirituality that addresses the material needs of folk that have been oppressed throughout century and millennia. It requires an understanding of personal transformation and healing that is also connected to collective transformation, not only of our communities and societies, but overall of an international movement of people that are trying to do what's right.
Right. Well, thank you for making that important distinction. Again, the constituents, the congregants that you're dealing with, are they open to this? Are they resistant? Is this something that they've heard before or felt in some way? Does it resonate with their own souls, if you will?
I think the most recent manifestation in my experience, especially throughout the pandemic, when in times of crises, people move towards some organizational body to find some relief, people have found through direct action, through meeting people's direct needs, whether it's by providing folks with food or providing folks with support that we've been doing very closely in this campaign, whether it's free food, tutoring, and doing cleanups or community engagement. You have to meet people where they are first. And when you meet people where they are, especially many folks in our communities that many attend houses of worship, they see that connection becomes a bridge to collective and community transformation. So how do we meet people's needs through direct action? And how does that direct action lead to people understanding the interdependence between us and between our neighbor? That our neighbor is not necessarily there to bring us down, but to build up. And I think that could be manifested politically through amazing works of mutual aid, direct action, and in times of crisis, that instinct or that yearning in people has become heightened, and people are looking for that community more often now than before. I would say like 10 or 20 years ago.
Yeah, I totally get that. I totally get that. I can understand what you're saying. Do you get bogged, or do you even discuss issues like abortion or anti-homosexuality within that framework? Has that become something that you need to get into at that point? Is that something that's going to turn them off from whatever else is going on? Or again, you talked about the love of the other, which actually comes more from the prophetic Hebrew tradition, the love of the other, which I want to get to with you a little later. But again, I'm so curious. Your background with your parents as Pentecostal ministers. How open is that more traditional world to what you're trying to do, Jonathan?
Well, I think the two very specific things you mentioned immediately brings to mind the movement from the right, what was very disingenuous. Right, it was more for xenophobia and putting fear in people that co-opted and hijacked pro-life or movements of traditional family in order to throw and create a very individualized and atomized individual that separated them from the neighbor. And I think people have seen that those two specific issues, especially when taken at the way they've taken in many traditional communities, does nothing to serve the neighbor. It's patriarchal and shames women and people who want to have children or have autonomies over their body into a way that's restrictive. And that these are politically motivated and in no way brings forth values of community, justice, and love for the neighbor. I think if we look at, we'll go straight to the most common example, but one that's so powerful, of Martin Luther King, who spoke about a liberative religious and spiritual practice, and that challenge the traditional framing of religion as an atomized vehicle, and specifically said, people talk a lot about capitalism and socialism, and King said very specifically that in this society, capitalism, there's rugged individualism for the poor and socialism for the rich. And I think that inversion, that understanding and that insight, that faith can be used as a tool, and not only as a tool, but an animating force for regenerative and for uplifting all people, is something that we're becoming more and more sensitive to. I would say also after COVID, the failure of the state in many ways to support people have shown that people want bread, people want opportunity, and people want community. And that the traditional fear mongering of those issues that you mentioned, that dehumanize the agency of human beings, is something that I think is becoming more and more, it's being passed over. Now, there are pockets of the country where that's very intense, but I think the task is to create new communities and relationships on this understanding, and that will overcome any fear mongering that exists on the conservative or right framing of these issues.
Including the structural racism that you find in the pitting of one ethnic and religious group against one another. I know you, I failed to mention it in the introduction, but you have a bachelor's degree from Fordham and a law degree from Brooklyn Law School. Do you have any formal, not that you need to, or just curious, do you have any divinity training as such?
Not specifically, even though I grew up teaching Sunday school and was ministering oftentimes. And it's interesting, my relationship with scripture definitely evolves. I was at Union Seminary for a bit, but in a working capacity, not necessarily in a theological capacity. But I think that's something that we're seeing everywhere now, that, there should not be a restriction on people being able to use scripture or faith as an authority to break down many of the misframings that we've seen on how spiritual practice has been shared. So for me, it's been incredibly enriching to read so many of the different theologians and spiritual practitioners, and nowadays so many healers, especially in the movements that are taking place throughout the country, people that are experimenting with social justice and use of psychedelics as a healing tool, or astrology and spiritual practice. I think that the institutionalizing and the gatekeeping that has resulted from so much academic and theological practice is being wide open. And now we're seeing this emergence of a new generation that's being able to introduce themselves to these spiritual practices and these scriptures in ways that are illuminating. So whereas you see maybe in one text an apocalyptic framing of, let's say, of the end times, really serves as a metaphor for how our capitalist and dominionist system is breaking, and that there may be a remnant that holds truth to love and justice, is able to get through crisis in order to see a new world emerge. So I think that reinterpretation is what's happening now, and that's incredibly exciting to see in different spaces that are talking about spirituality and liberation.
Absolutely. I promise we'll get to the questions on the indigenous healing and transformation and the use of psychedelics and so on. Let's build up to that in a sense. What are some of the other moral traditions that should inform or guide progressive campaigns and movements? And how have they come to concretely play themselves out in policies and other ways in your own work in the AOC campaign? Because we did play a 4-minute clip that AOC had on on Cornell West's podcast. And interestingly, it was entitled "AOC is Not Understood for Who She Really Is." And the 4-minute clip I picked out was very much discussing her own spiritual journey. So I think there was a lot of questions all tied in there, but you and the campaign and these are examples of new ways of thinking about transforming and healing the world that goes beyond the dogmatic, ritualistic, static definitions that so many of us have experienced in all the religious traditions. Is that what you're getting at? And what are some of these newer progressive traditions you'd like to discuss for us in the show?
Yeah, that was an incredible interview, and not here to speak on behalf of the Congresswoman, but I think her insight and the way she expressed her expression of faith was so powerful, especially the idea of non-attachment, attaching oneself to expectations, because all expectations are shaped by this superstructure of capitalism and dominionism that seeks to enlarge the individual at the expense of the collective. So I think that's one definitely that I carry deep within. As an organizer and someone that practices organizing with my neighbors, a very inspiring book everyone should read, Adrienne Marie Brown's Emergent Strategy. Incredibly powerful, is inspired by science fiction, Black writer Octavia Butler. But in those books, she has a rule that I try to live by, which is very powerful. Move at the speed of trust. So we organize collectively at the speed of which our individual and our neighbor can trust us. And it's very important, because oftentimes when people engage in politics or in this space, they try to shove ideology down your throat without understanding that there's a praxis, that the theory must be accompanied by the praxis, and that we cannot judge every philosophy by its misuse. And the only way we do that is by sharing space and time. Another rule that I love that's in that book as well again, emergent strategy, Adrian Marie Brown, who also grew up evangelical, non-denominational parents, and who was able to just create this amazing space in facilitation, is that small is all. In scripture, we see where Jesus says, and I'm not institutional religious follower, and I don't identify as Christian. I identify as spiritual, but Jesus's words, especially the carpenter, was very inspiring, saying where two or three are there with an intention, nothing is impossible. And I truly believe that. If we can model something with another individual, and we have a distributed network of organizing that practice, it could spread and literally change the world, what we do. So I think it's very important to understand that we must move at the speed of trust, that engaging and with people in the present is incredibly important. And that's one spiritual practice I've been trying to develop with myself, is being aware of now. One of the things I believe capitalism does very well is alienates us from the present, and it embeds us into the future, so that we're either always detached from the material present reality of now, and being able to understand that the person in front of me, the neighbors around me, are really the people I'm here to serve at this time. That's been incredibly powerful. And we've modeled that in many ways through our mutual aid work, whether, as mentioned, it was with the food distribution or with providing tutoring or homework help in many ways. But those are some of the principles that I've been able to carry with me, and so many others. But we just wanted to share a few.
No. Reverend Barber talks about that to a certain extent when he talks about the remnant, the ancient Israelites, and remembering the oppression that they had. And even though in the face of this catastrophe, as Cornell West would put it, the struggle to still believe and to go on and to pass on that memory and not be pacified by it and defeated by it. And maybe there's only a few, after a few thousand years, that can reach back and understand that. But as you say, that's all you need, because, well, you explain it better than I can. I mean, this is so central to human existence, to what it means to be a human being and to love, and what we need, that it can withstand the immense cruelty and barbaric conditions that so many people have gone through most of civilization. So is this partly what you're talking about here on in connecting to that that belief that in the remnant and the love of the other, as the prophetic Hebrew tradition tells us, even those who have been cruel to us because we were a stranger in a strange land, that doesn't, again, mean that we should go bully other people. And we need to transform and transcend that own experience into radical love.
That is such a powerful point. And the idea of remnant, especially as we think about the crises that are unfolding right now, whether it's the biological one, the economic one, the military one, there are just so many that are taking place time and time again. And these crises are intensifying and increasing in frequency and intensity. So what must happen is to have a counterculture, to be in opposition to the main dogma, is something critically important. And I think the main thing is this idea of the individual. Obviously I experienced reality as an individual, but through meditation and spiritual practice, you see that lots of it's illusion, right? The individual is an illusion in many senses. When we see this really focus on that, and to dissolve that idea and to see that there is a deep interconnectedness, I think that's the task right now. So the remnant, being a remnant that understands that by just focusing and serving the self is not the way to liberation or salvation. As many radical and powerful just anarchists and abolitionists have told us, if there's someone that's not free, then I'm not free. If there's someone that's hungering and there's someone that is in pain, I'm in pain. And that's really countercultural. And I think that's the remnant that we need to enter into the remnant that sees self-interest as something that is not in the next stage of our evolution as human beings, but understanding of the collective and collective liberation is possible. This isn't to say that individual freedom or democracy are all fictions. They can be, especially the way they're expressed in this time and age. But we must really let go of the idea that we are just here alone and atomized. And hopefully more and more folks understand that. So we reach the tipping point so that we can turn the remnant into a mass movement, because that's ultimately what's needed, the masses. A world without the masses, an ideology without the masses is a world that definitely don't want to be in.
Well, as you know, Jonathan, I'm certainly a remnant from the 60s. So when you start talking about counterculture, I just, whoa, yes, I haven't heard that in a while, but I certainly was involved, lived through it. Went to University of Colorado, Boulder, which was quite a haven for that counterculture and so on. And although not a full-blown member of that countercultural, I certainly identified with it to a considerable extent. I was more involved in the political transformation, but that's not here nor there right now. But when you talk about this countercultural consciousness, the need to understand what indigenous people can teach us about, and as you mentioned before, now a couple of times, the use of psychedelics. Would you expand on that for our audience, who might be a little wary of what you're trying to say here, because of the bad mouthing, I think, of that hippie subculture, counterculture, which, after all, basically said, there were certainly excesses, make love, not war. So, hey, okay, go ahead.
Yeah, well, thank you for that great segue. I think it's really interesting when we think about spiritual practice as how it developed and the way it's expressed itself in numerous ways. And I think that when we talk about countercultural, especially in this day and age, what is centered is, especially as we've seen with the passing of the Afghanistan war, right, is dominionism and imperial force and might. So it's the ability to literally have the audacity to believe that you could change a state by taking it over, and investing trillions of dollars in nation building instead of investing in our education, in our healthcare, et cetera, et cetera. So when speaking of counterculture, I think it's speaking against or in counter to this idea of dominionism. And part of what we need to do is have a revolution of consciousness, a revolution in psychology. Oftentimes we think of institutions as being outside of ourselves. But in reality, all of our consciousness, our language, our systems of symbols, the way we even think and we take sense data and reconstruct it within ourselves are shaped by the media, are shaped by the way we were conditioned and socialized in society. So it's not that the systems live outside of us, but they live inside of us as well. So the way I conceive of the world.
Yeah, we've internalized and taken it in. It's a very distorted view that, again, a very materialistic culture and a very violent culture wants us to believe. Right. So, and again, I think I mentioned we've had Carl Hart on this show a few times, and Carl is a leading, of course, drug researcher at Columbia. He's come out recently with statements that we need to legalize all drugs. And that doesn't mean that with certain understanding that some people should be having them, and that's his mission, that these drugs can liberate us from a very toxic consciousness. So how does, again, in full transparency here, I never was on an LSD trip, but as I think I told you, I did accompany a few people who were on their trips, and many of them were pretty solid, good, happy vehicles. A couple weren't, but so my point is, again, try to be specific here in terms of what you're talking about in terms of the liberation of drugs here, and what sort of drugs you're talking about, and I guess LSD is specifically.
Sure. I mean, I think we've seen in a couple of states the legalization of psychedelics, or the decriminalizing of psychedelics for therapeutic purposes. So when we talk about psychedelics, there's psilocybin mushrooms, and indigenous traditions in Latin America, we have ayahuasca. But if we look at the drugs that are centered in our society, the efficiency drugs, whether it's alcohol, tobacco, coffee, they kind of strengthen and solidify the ego. And the ego, in my spiritual practice, is, it grows like a cancer, right? The ego grows, and anything that stimulates that, I think we've had an over-determination of those things, and maybe we need to soften the ego bit a bit. And look at how indigenous practices, like Peru or Guatemala, have used healing and ayahuasca, for example. Peyote as another thing. Obviously, I'm not speaking as a scientist or a researcher. This is just purely based on readings and some personal experience. But I do think there is something we need to dissolve our current ways of thinking, and what these and I don't even want to call them drugs, because I'm talking specifically about natural substances. These natural healing substances have shown that they can produce radically powerful effects when it comes to us not being as dependent on addiction, being able to have psychological renewals of different ways. So, the drug war, as many of us know, has been used by the military and the CIA and different ways to, fund wars. So why cannot we look into and have deeper research into how these healing plants and entities could possibly lead to a psychological renewal of our society? Again, not speaking as a scientist or researcher, but speaking as someone, through personal experience. And I believe that this is something we need to explore, and that should be explored. So as I think you've recently seen, there have been some amendments that have been introduced in Congress for the decriminalization of these psychedelics. I think a bill came up recently by the congresswoman, but we should do more of that. Because when we use things for profit and commodification, as many of our drugs have been used, we've seen how that damages the psyche and it injures ourselves. So how about some healing, and how about respect for indigenous practice, and understanding how many of these healing sources of nature have really helped us throughout the way. So we definitely should be looking into that.
Right, absolutely. As alternatives to big pharma, and talk about legal addiction, that's a whole other issue. But what's interesting too is this: we're not saying that one needs to go on these so-called trips to be fully liberated. One does it in a variety of ways. I know that in the clip that we showed, again, the congresswoman talked about her trip to Black Rock. And what seemed to be very interesting there was her understanding, I think, that you're talking about too, to go beyond oneself, and in a more traditional religious sense, or spiritual sense, let's call it, when she begins to talk about Lord making me a vessel, small is all. So again, what does that mean in terms of spiritual values? We're talking about transcending one's own ego and oftentimes distorted vision of what we need and so on, and be of service to others, and to reach out again, politically to the disenfranchised and the poor and so on. It's obvious that the entire society needs to do that, and we need to start somewhere. So take us on your understanding of how that can happen.
Absolutely. There was an amazing theologian that I read, and the name escapes me right now. But when I was at Union, and it should be posted, the quotation, because it's so great. But their practice was to treat the needs of the people as holy. To treat the needs of the people as holy. For me, being able to understand that the practice has to be decentered from the self, and has to be connected to others, whether that's done through service, whether it's driving as mentioned to BlackRock, and being able to expand beyond oneself for a cause that touches people throughout different spaces and times, and understanding that practice is what is calls us and regenerates us in many ways. So it could be very, very damaging to the psyche, as we've seen during this pandemic, when events outside of ourselves conflict with our self-interest. And what I've noticed in this part, especially during the pandemic, is that when I've gotten and started centering less and less my needs and more the needs of my neighbor, that's where the regeneration, that's where the ability to just find new energy in times of crisis has been so important. So I would say being able, as mentioned by the theologian, to view the people's needs as holy. And we talk about holiness, we're talking about something sacred. We're talking about something that's powerful. So one of my favorite verses in scripture, Ecclesiastes 3:11, God has made everything beautiful in its time, has set eternity upon the hearts of all people, without people knowing the work of God from beginning to end. So the fact that there is divinity stamped in each and one of us, and that you cannot grasp it by knowing, but you can grasp it by faith through action, right? And I think that's the thing. We have a prejudice and epistemological prejudice towards knowing things that could only be structured and codified and categorized through language, whereas acts, feeling, emotions, and service, those things going beyond knowing, that's where we could know God, and God's love, whether that's in this time or in other times. And it sounds very mystical, and I know that some folks may find this to be gibberish in many respects, but to millions of people, billions of people, it's a deep personal experience. So maybe less haughtiness and maybe more humility and understanding that people's experience cannot only be categorized in our over determinist rational framing of Western society, that there is something mystical about the human experience that can only be activated through love. And I think that's the world we choose to live in, and that I choose to live in, at least.
Totally agree, and it's not gibberish. I know most people don't see it, but let me throw not a monkey wrench into any of this. But what about people who act on their belief systems? Eric Hopper, the philosopher, talked about it in his book, The True Believer. What about anti-democratic, neo-fascist forces who believe very deeply that they are doing good in the world to get rid of sin and people that they considered degenerate and horrible, deviant people? I mean, Hitler, in a sense, felt he was cleansing the world by getting rid of non-Aryans, not just Jews. So what do we do with these anti-democratic forces, anti-fascistic forces that you see propped up here in this country as we attempt to relate to our brothers and sisters here? That we're all God's creatures, but is the platform fair? How do we deal with people who are at this point attacking the very source of our democracy? How do you speak?
Right. I think there's two instincts that we can have, or two ways to move in this space. One is, folks that are attracted to fascism have made an idol of the nation, have made an idol of their history, and don't understand that life and God is ever changing, ever evolving, immutable in love. Right, that's the only thing that doesn't change. I believe in God, God's love, or the energy, but
Right.
the changing elements and the expressions of it are always going to change. So I think that the desire for static, domineering, and total, like what they view as potential, and they've made an idol of it and projected it outward into the state, that inevitably is going to change. So I believe that all kingdoms will fall, that every nation will eventually be dissolved, and hopefully we get to a stateless and classless society soon. But eventually, it's not a matter of when or if. So our task is to accelerate it. And how do we accelerate the deconstruction of fascism? Not only first through love, but I think that we have to be strategic in the understanding that we need to create distributive systems that seek to empower working people, poor people, understanding that Black, Brown, Indigenous folks have been at the butt end of this, that we need an inversion, that the last must be first, that every mountaintop must be made into a molehill, things that a revolutionary Palestinian Jew named Jesus talked about. And that I think, our greatest hope is to, as you saw, the redemption and the redeeming of all people. And I do think that that's something that we've been struggling with as a society, especially recently, is that, we become, and we want to become, the oppressor in turn. So to the extent that we're reactionary, and to the extent that we just want to reify systems of oppression and place ourselves on top, that's going to delay the inevitable fall of injustice. So I would say that was something important.
Right. Not only that, Jonathan, it is, as Barber points out, it is heretical and it's distortion of what God's love is. Violence is the opposite. And as I'm looking here, we've got a couple minutes, and I wanted you to have a chance to comment on someone that you held very dearly in your heart and was a very great influence in your heart, Michael Brooks. And I also want to try to couple that with members in our audience here who know Stanley Aronowitz, and he was on the very, very first Radical Imagination show. He passed on a couple of days ago. And I know Michael also passed on recently. These are great, great figures, and I want to give you the last minute or two. It should be more, I know, but tell me a little about your friend and comrade here and your loss.
Yeah, at first, deepest condolences to you, as well as the entire community. Stanley was just inspiring. And I think that, when we have people that leave us, and I feel that they leave not entirely, but they're with us in other dimensions.
Absolutely, absolutely.
That's the goal, is to revive and animate what they've been able to leave behind in a way that honors their legacy. And for me, Michael, it's very interesting. I think what he represented was not only a platforming of a lot of these ideas, spiritual ideas and spiritual legacies, and to have the courage to speak about them boldly and with certainty, and not to be bowed down by folks who misunderstand, but that want to ridicule spiritual practice. It was just so encouraging to see. Many of the people I've mentioned here, have shaped my understanding of spiritual formation. But Michael spoke about it without any fear, and he knew his stuff, and platformed what I think was really exciting moment in a lot of the recent leftist kind of like media ecosystem, is an acknowledgement and an understanding, and an acceptance that people come from different material realities that include a deep inner spiritual practice. and that we must honor those. That we can't judge philosophies based on their misuse, but that we, through dialogue, can not only interrogate, investigate, but even integrate ideas that may have been out of base for us, but now through a expression of relationship and love, we're like, oh wow, that's something that I could apply in my own practice. So for me, Michael being able to do that was incredibly, I would say, encouraging, and emboldened me to go and speak more boldly in this space about this. I've done so in different religious or spiritual contexts, but now being able to say so at my local, chapter meeting, at the socialist gatherings, and be able to speak about spirituality and be like, hey, there's actually a reference point that you may have listened to. That provides more courage. So for that, I'm deeply grateful for their contributions.
Well put, so well put, and you do it so magnificently as well. And Stanley would agree, and Stanley was with us with his radical imagination. Thank you so very, very much, Jonathan. This has been really terrific. We need to do this again and again and again. But take care, be strong, and thank you so very much for being part of the radical imagination, and for our audience and for me. You've enlightened me on several issues, and I will look forward to continuing our relationship.
Thank you so very much, Jim, and thank the audience for taking time, and look forward to the next conversation. Take care.
Absolutely.
And God bless.
Absolutely. God bless. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you so very, very much, all of you, for watching The Radical Imagination this week. This is Jim Vrettos. We'll see you again next week on The Radical Imagination.
It's pretty hard to find ministers who consider themselves part of the radical movement, or at least sympathetic to the radical movement.
We have Leah and Perry Berkowitz.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think they'd be open to it.
Well, they try their best at All Souls. They have services every year there, and they're going to be doing some services with us. And
Stanley's point is
well
the
taken.
shrinking of the public spaces in churches, mosques, synagogues, civic institutions across the board. But that's part of the one-dimensionality that Herbert Marcuse talked about, in which you sap the very sources of resistance intellectually, politically, socially, and spiritually. Same would be true in terms of the artists. What does the soundtrack today for the younger generation sound like in Ferguson? They got to go back more to Sly and the Family Stone and Gil Scott-Heron and Curtis Mayfield and Aretha Franklin than most of their artists, even though Kendrick Lamar and Erykah Badu and some others would kick in. But it's part of the spiritual malnutrition and moral constipation of our culture. And you can never have a movement if you don't have some spiritual heft and if you don't have some moral substance.
I'll go beyond that, although I agree with everything you said. Unions go on strike. People go marching for climate change in New York, 100,000 people.
300,000.
Well,
Who knows? Okay.
Who knows? What doesn't matter?
All right. Yeah.
Did they sing?
Not where I was. No.
And movement.
We always sang in.
That's right.
We sang in jail.
No, we sang in jail.
The movement that doesn't sing.
Phelps and
the
others.
movement that doesn't sing withers.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
It's part of the. And I'm not
And
saying
the comedians
it
and
can't
the
be the old
dancers
folk
and
Brother
music.
Randy,
Probably it has to be something that is much closer to contemporary, modern.
That's right.
We're going to have Moral Technique here. He's going to educate us.
giant.
Well, I'm not talking about moral technique is good, but I'm talking about the people.
Well, it's
music
too.
And here's a story. We take over the union of the City University, which represents now 23,000. It's called the Professional Staff Congress. We had a rank and file bottom-up movement, and we took over the union in 2000.
Okay.
And we have a rally, a meeting after we win. We're so excited because we beat an old, established, bureaucratic institution of the American Federation of Teachers. Mm-hmm. And so people say, Stanley, I was on the board. I was a negotiator later on. They say, do you know Solidarity Forever? I said, well, if I don't know Solidarity Forever, I might as well hang up and die, you know? So I sing Solidarity Forever, And hardly anybody of the 800 people that are sitting in the audience knows Solidarity Forever, which is the iconic union song which goes back to the industrial workers of the world. And they don't know it. It's not their fault.
Yeah.
The labor movement has completely forgot its own traditions, its own best traditions.
Oh.
And we're going to have to find ways to revive them. They can't be revived only with the Moral Mondays. I'm not against that. Or only with the school that we established, or only with the institute that I'm part of called the Institute of the Radical Imagination. We have to do it with some larger perspective and larger institutional base. And we have to say to the artists who are interested in this, make records for the movement, not just commercial records. They're good, but make records for the movement. Come to rallies and sing and teach people how to what those songs are about.
That's it.
Absolutely.
How to do hip hop. He could teach hip hop. Cornell West.
Well, you got your group, right? Cornell West.
Well, Cornell West, no, I mean, they just named it after me, but that's not my group. That's Tim Hicks and the others, but they do magnificent work.
And you've been down there, and he knows what he's doing.
I'm in the studio with him, though. But I'm old
Yeah.
school. I'm like Stanley, though. I'm trying to hold up the great standards, the great examples, the great exemplars of integrity, honesty, decency, courage, vision, people willing to live and die for freedom. That is the precondition for any kind of movement, even as a younger generation has to define and write their own songs relative to the circumstances that they're dealing with.
Or the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee took the songs from the church.
And then just
Let me give you an example. I'm going to sing a little bit. So, when Paul Robeson in the 1940s and 50s made a record for This Little Light of Mine, he'd go, "This little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine." There you are.
Yeah.
And then when the SNCC people took it up, "This little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. Da, 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 this little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. Even in Mississippi, I'm going to let it shine. Even in Mississippi, I'm going to let it shine. Even in Mississippi, I'm going to let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine."
No, that's rich. That's rich. And you can see how that's even a secular version of what I learned in Shiloh Baptist Church under Reverend Willie P. Cook, where he used to say, if the kingdom of God is within you, then everywhere you go, you ought to leave a little heaven behind. So if you in a nightmarish, gut bucket, Jim Crow, Mississippi, it ain't nothing but hell. In the middle of hell, the kingdom of God is within you. You leaving heaven behind by making a blow for justice.
And that was in Sacramento, California.
That's Sacramento, California. the chocolate side of Sacramento, California. Absolutely. It's a great tradition.
But we've lost all that. We've lost it,
Well, we're revising that now,
we're
right?
trying.
That's part of the radical imagination.
That's part of the
The radical imagination is
imagination.
just not about institutions. It's about a whole way of life.
Way of life, absolutely.
It's a whole mode of being in the world and all of the various practices that go along with that.
And it's not just some sort of fantasy here.
Oh, no, this is on the ground.
It's
This
on the
is on
ground,
the
and it has
ground.
reality. And that we do
That's
have
right.
history and examples that we can...
When I was a union organizer, Jim,
Yeah.
and I spent 7 years as a union organizer, every time we had a strike or we had a union meeting,
Right.
I would teach people how to sing union songs. They didn't know. They had completely lost the touch with their own traditions. And in some of the local unions that I actually spent a good deal of time with, by the time I was gone, they were singing songs themselves without me. Now that's a victory.
That's what you want. That's what you want.
Man of
Because it's
many-
also true that Stanley, the 82, I'm 62, but we passing slowly off the historical stage, and we want to be
Very
able to
slowly.
pass
Let's
it
push
on
this.
to the young brother like
Yeah, I'm a
you're gonna be
young
around
guy.
for a while.
I'm in between you guys. What do you think?
I thought you were about 56.
Oh, okay. Yeah, well, all right. Okay. Let's push it. We're taking it slow. We got a long time to go here.
He's not passing.
No, he's not passing anywhere. He's gonna stick
I'm
around.
going down fighting no matter what.
One
Gotta
of
tell
the
you that.
things that we are
I'm going
not,
down swinging.
one of the things that we
Couple
are not
minutes.
doing,
What are we not doing?
we're not going silently into the night.
There you go.
There you go.
Those people who go, Grace Boggs just died. She was 100.
100 years
100.
old.
She
Yeah.
did not go silently.
That's
She
right.
was swinging like Ella Fitzgerald and Muhammad Ali till the end. We love Grace for that.
Well, listen, we only have a minute or so left. Any final thoughts here as we wrap up our first show of the Radical Imagination? I am so happy to have had you here.
I want to thank you for allowing me to reconnect with my brother. I can see him once a year. It just adds years to my life. I have the memories that we have going back almost 40 years when I was very young, learning much from him, and he was embracing me in such a magnificent way.
Yeah.
And to think you could have
Isn't
such
that
a
beautiful?
visionary Jewish brother from New York City.
There you go.
With a black brother from the chocolate side of Sacramento, California, and be friends, comrades, partners, companions, and still swinging.
Beautiful.
I'm going to sing one verse from
All right.
Solidarity.
As we go out here, one more minute. Thank you all so much
In our hands
for
is
joining us.
placed the power greater than their hoarded gold, greater than the might of armies magnified 1,000-fold. We can bring to birth the new world from the ashes of the old, for the union makes us strong.
Liberté, égalité.
Fraternité. Liberté. Égalité.
Fraternité. Liberté.
Égalité.
Fraternité. Liberté, égalité. Fraternité.
Liberté. Égalité.
Fraternité. Liberté, égalité.
Fraternité.